The Langford estate sat on the edge of the Pacific cliffs, a fortress of glass and stone that caught the morning sun like a jewel. It was the kind of home that looked perfect: manicured lawns, imported marble floors, and a silence so heavy it felt sacred. Yet inside those walls there lingered something colder than marble: absence. Miles Langford hadn't been home in 3 months. To the world, he was a name that opened doors. A billionaire entrepreneur. A self-made genius whose face graced magazine covers. But beneath that polished surface was a man who had traded presence for power, family for empire. His son, Daniel, was 10 years old and growing up fast. Too fast. Without really knowing what a father's voice sounded like at the dinner table. It was a Friday morning when Miles's flight landed earlier than expected. He had canceled his meeting in Tokyo. Something inside him had felt off. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the way Daniel's last message to him had ended with a short, almost indifferent "Okay, Dad." He told his driver not to inform anyone, for once. He wanted to walk through his own front door without the house being staged for his arrival. No polished smiles, no rehearsed greetings. Just reality. As his black Mercedes turned into the driveway, the estate loomed ahead, bathed in soft California light. The automatic gates whispered open, and for the first time in years, Miles Langford felt like a stranger approaching his own home. He stepped out quietly, suitcase in hand, his Italian shoes crunching over the gravel. The air was sharp with sea salt. He noticed something odd: laughter, faint but clear, carried by the wind from the backyard. Children's laughter. Daniel's laughter. He followed it instinctively, his heartbeat quickening with something he couldn't name. Longing, perhaps. The sound led him through the side path to the backyard patio, where sunlight poured over the grass like gold dust, and that's when he froze. There, beneath the old oak tree, his son sat cross-legged on a picnic blanket. His small hands were covered in flour, his cheeks streaked with white powder. Beside him was Clara, their housemaid, a black woman in her mid-40s, wearing a simple apron and the kind of warm, patient smile that made even silence feel safe. In front of them sat a tray of freshly baked cookies, unevenly shaped but clearly made with care. Daniel was laughing so hard he could barely speak. "You put too much sugar, Clara. And whose idea was it to add marshmallows, huh?" she teased, wagging a finger. He giggled again, that rare, unguarded sound that Miles hadn't heard in years. Miles stood there, speechless, watching the scene unfold like a painting he didn't remember commissioning. There was something profoundly human about it. Simple, ordinary, but full of the kind of warmth that no amount of money could buy. Clara turned suddenly, spotting him by the sliding doors. Her smile faltered, replaced by surprise. She stood quickly, brushing her hands on her apron. "Mr. Langford." "I didn't know you were coming home, sir." Daniel turned too, his eyes widening. "Dad." Miles tried to smile, but something in his throat caught. "Surprise," he said quietly. For a few seconds, the air felt thick with awkwardness. Then Daniel ran forward and hugged him. It was quick, shy, the kind of hug that spoke more of politeness than affection. And that stung. He ruffled his son's hair, forcing a grin. "Looks like I came just in time for cookie day." Clara smiled nervously. "We just started doing this recently. Helps him unwind after school." Miles nodded absently, glancing at the table of cookies. "Looks like you've both gotten pretty good at it." "Not really," Daniel said proudly. "But Clara says it's not about being good. It's about doing things together." Those words hit Miles harder than he expected. Doing things together. He couldn't remember the last time he'd done anything together with his son, the unspoken truth. Rest of the day unfolded in strange, quiet moments. Miles walked through his home as though rediscovering it. The house was spotless, but it felt alive, not sterile like before. There were drawings on the refrigerator now, small sticky notes on the kitchen wall that said things like, "Remember Science Fair," and Daniel's soccer game. He hadn't seen those touches before. Later that afternoon, he found Daniel and Clara sitting in the library. Daniel was reading out loud from a children's adventure novel, while Clara listened, smiling and correcting his pronunciation softly. Miles stood by the door unnoticed. His son's voice was confident, full of excitement. It made him realize something painful. The last time he'd read to Daniel, his boy had been 6. He cleared his throat and stepped inside. "Mind if I join?" Daniel looked surprised but nodded eagerly. "You can read the next chapter, Dad." Clara quietly stood. "I'll make some tea." But Miles gestured gently. "Stay, Clara. You've earned your seat." She hesitated, unsure, then sat again. Her hands folded neatly on her lap as Miles took over the reading. His voice started out stiff, corporate almost, but softened as he went along. By the time the chapter ended, Daniel was leaning on his shoulder, sleepy and content. Miles looked down at him, at the peace on his face, and something in his chest cracked open. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed this. A night of reckoning, after Daniel went to bed, Miles found Clara in the kitchen cleaning up. The clock read nearly midnight. "You didn't have to wait up," he said. She smiled faintly. "I always make sure the kitchen's closed before I turn in." "Old habits," he nodded. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he said quietly, "You've been spending a lot of time with Daniel." "Yes, sir," she said, lowering her eyes. "After Mrs. Langford passed, he needed someone to talk to." "I didn't mean to overstep," Miles interrupted gently. "You didn't overstep. You filled a space I didn't even realize was empty." Her eyes flickered with emotion. "He's a good boy, Mr. Langford. He just misses his father." That hit deeper than any boardroom confrontation ever could. Miles leaned against the counter, running a hand over his face. "I thought giving him everything would make up for my absence. Turns out I gave him everything except the one thing he actually needed." Clara hesitated, then said softly, "Sometimes, sir, children don't remember what you buy for them. They remember how you made them feel." Her words hung in the air like a quiet truth, undeniable and heavy. Miles looked up at her. "You've done more for my son than I have in years." "Thank you," she shook her head. "I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because I see him. And I saw you too, sir. The man trying to do right but forgetting what right really means." He swallowed hard. "You're not just a maid, Clara. You're..." "Family?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Family isn't about blood or money, Mr. Langford. It's about love and choice. The gift of presence." The following week, Miles canceled his upcoming business trip. His assistant thought he was losing his mind. But something in him had shifted. He started having breakfast at home. Awkwardly at first, but Daniel seemed thrilled. They'd sit together over pancakes, with Clara bustling around the kitchen. She'd tease Miles for burning toast, and he'd laugh genuinely, like a man rediscovering laughter. One morning, Daniel announced, "Clara's teaching me how to cook. We're making mac and cheese tonight." Miles grinned. "Then I guess I'm your sous chef." Clara chuckled. "You sure you can handle the heat, boss?" "For my son, always." The laughter that followed filled the house in ways money never could. Weeks passed and word spread in the household. Mr. Langford had changed. He was home more, calmer, even kind. He'd begun donating to community centers and schools, quietly, without press. But when asked, he'd always say, "I'm just giving back to people like Clara," because it was true. She had given him something no deal or acquisition ever could. Perspective. The day everything changed, one. Stormy night, Clara didn't come to work. She never missed a day. Miles grew uneasy. By noon, he drove to the address listed in her employee file, a small apartment in the poorer side of town. When he knocked, a young neighbor told him she'd been taken to the hospital. Without hesitation, he drove straight there. When he entered the hospital room, Clara looked frail but smiled faintly. "Mr. Langford? You didn't have to come all the way here." "I did," he said, pulling a chair close. "You scared us," she laughed softly. "Just exhaustion." "I've been overdoing it," he shook his head. "You've been taking care of us more than yourself." There was silence, then she whispered, "Promise me you'll keep being there for Daniel." "He needs you." "I will," he said, voice thick, "because you reminded me what being a father means." Her eyes softened. "Then I can rest easy." The real wealth weeks later, Clara recovered, though she decided to retire. On her last day, the entire staff gathered in the garden, even Daniel holding a small handmade card that read, "Thank you for being my family." Clara hugged him tightly, tears spilling freely. "You've got a good heart, Danny. Don't ever forget that." Miles stepped forward and handed her a small envelope. "This is for you," she frowned. "Sir, I can't take—" "It's not charity," he said. "It's gratitude. You gave me back my son." Inside was the deed to a small house by the sea. Her dream. She stared at it in disbelief, then at him. "Mr. Langford, this is too much," he smiled softly. "You taught me that the right thing isn't about what's too much. It's about what's enough." She wept quietly, and for the first time Miles pulled her into a hug. Genuine, unguarded. "You'll always have a home here," he whispered. The full circle months later, as summer painted the sky in orange and gold, Miles sat on that same backyard bench under the oak tree, the place where everything had changed. Daniel sat beside him, taller now, smiling as he showed his father a cookie recipe. "Clara would be proud," Miles said, gazing at the horizon. "I know," Daniel grinned. "But she'd say we used too much sugar again." They laughed, and in that laughter was everything. Love, loss, gratitude, and the quiet understanding that real wealth wasn't in fortune or fame. It was in the people who reminded you what truly mattered. Miles looked at his son and said, "You know, Danny, the best investment I ever made wasn't in a company. It was in coming home." Daniel smiled, leaning against him. "And in baking cookies?" Miles chuckled. "Especially that." The waves crashed softly against the cliffs, and as the sun sank lower, the billionaire who once measured life in profits finally understood. The richest moments were the ones money could never buy. A year later, the seasons turned gently along the California coast. A year had passed since Clara's farewell, but her spirit lingered in the Langford home like sunlight after rain. Miles had changed, not just in schedule, but in soul. He no longer measured his days in meetings or profits, but in moments. Moments like Daniel's laughter at breakfast, the smell of pancakes on Saturday mornings, and the quiet joy of watching his son grow. Not from a distance, but right beside him. The house had changed too. It was no longer a museum of marble and glass. It had become a home. There were flowers in jars on the kitchen table, soccer shoes by the back door, and photos framed on the walls. Not corporate portraits, but memories. Daniel and Clara baking. Daniel's first soccer goal, a candid shot of all three of them, laughing mid-cookie disaster. One evening, as twilight brushed the horizon, Miles found himself sitting on the patio, a cup of coffee warming his hands. Daniel came bounding out holding a school notebook. "Dad, look, we had to write an essay about our hero." Miles smiled. "And who'd you pick? Some astronaut? A basketball player?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I wrote about Clara." Miles froze for a moment, throat tightening. "You did?" "Yeah," Daniel said, sitting beside him. "I said she taught me that being strong isn't about how much money you have. It's about how much love you give away, and that even if someone isn't your family by blood, they can still be your home." Miles looked at his son, so honest, so wise, and felt tears sting his eyes. "She'd be proud of you, Daniel." Daniel grinned. "She'd say we still need to work on our cookies." They laughed together, the sound carrying into the evening air, the legacy of love. Later that year, on Clara's birthday, Miles and Daniel drove down the coast to her little cottage by the sea, the one she'd called her peaceful place. They brought flowers, a basket of cookies, and a small plaque engraved with her favorite saying, "Family isn't about blood, it's about love and choice." They placed it by the garden gate, where the wind carried the scent of wild lavender. Miles knelt down, brushing his hand against the plaque. "You gave us both more than we ever gave you," he whispered. "You taught me to see people. Not positions, not profits, but hearts." Daniel placed the cookies on the small table outside the cottage. "Happy birthday, Clara," he said softly. For a moment, the breeze lifted, warm, soft, and full, as though the world itself smiled back. A new beginning back home. Miles made one more decision, the kind that changed lives beyond his own. He founded a scholarship program in Clara's name, the Clara Brooks Foundation for Children and Caregivers, offering education to those who dedicated their lives to others. He didn't make a public announcement. There were no cameras, no press releases, just quiet impact, the way Clara would have wanted it. One afternoon, he watched as the first group of scholarship recipients visited the estate for a small gathering. They were young mothers, caretakers, and students, all full of hope. A woman approached him, tears in her eyes. "Mr. Langford, my daughter will go to college because of this." "Thank you." Miles shook his head. "Thank Clara. She's the reason we're all standing here." As he said it, he felt her presence again, not in memory, but in the living heartbeat of kindness that now flowed through everything she'd touched. Full circle that night. As the waves crashed softly below the cliffs, Miles stood by the window watching the moonlight dance on the ocean. Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch, clutching a photo of himself with Clara. Miles whispered to the night, "You were right, Clara. Family is choice." Then he walked over to his son, tucking a blanket around him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man trying to fix the past. He felt like a man finally living the present. He looked around his once empty mansion and smiled. The house wasn't silent anymore. It breathed. It loved. It lived. Epilogue. The richest man alive years later. Long after Daniel had grown and inherited his father's gentle heart. People still spoke of Miles Langford, the billionaire, who built empires but found his fortune in something far greater. They said his greatest project wasn't a company or an invention. It was a legacy of kindness. A story that began the day he came home unannounced and saw his son laughing beside a woman who had nothing, yet gave everything. And somewhere beyond the veil of time, perhaps Clara smiled, whispering what she had always believed. Love is the only wealth that multiplies when shared. 10 years later, the waves still broke against the cliffs, though the house above them had changed again. Where marble once gleamed, now hung photographs and children's art. The Langford estate was no longer a symbol of status, but a place of gathering, a home that opened its doors instead of guarding them. Miles had silver in his hair now. He rose earlier, not to race to meetings, but to walk the garden trail Clara used to tend. Daniel, 20 now, studied social work at the State University on a scholarship named after the woman who'd changed them both. He came home most weekends, bringing friends who called the billionaire Mr. L, and filled the kitchen with chatter. One Sunday morning, they baked again. Daniel flipped the cookies onto a tray, laughing. "You know, I still can't make them come out even." Miles smiled. Neither could she. They set a small plate on the windowsill, 3 warm cookies and a single daisy. It had become their ritual, a quiet thank you to the woman who had taught them how to live, a conversation by the sea. That afternoon, father and son walked down to the beach. The tide was low, leaving rippled sand that shone like bronze. Daniel skipped a stone into the water. "Dad," he said, "when you first came home that day, did you know everything would change?" Miles shook his head. "I just knew I was tired of being rich in all the wrong ways." Daniel looked out across the ocean. "I think about her a lot, about how she made ordinary things feel special. That was her gift," Miles said. "She made people feel seen, and that's what real wealth is, seeing and being seen." For a long time they stood together, the wind lifting the edge of their jackets, the sky fading from gold to violet, the foundation's promise back at the estate. A group of young scholarship recipients gathered for the annual ceremony. There were children playing on the lawn, music drifting from a small band, and the scent of baked goods. Daniel had insisted on serving Clara's cookie recipe every year. Miles took the stage, his voice steady but warm. "Clara Brooks once worked in my home," he began, "but what she really did was build it. She taught my son and me that compassion is the architecture of every lasting thing. This foundation is," her story continued, "proof that kindness can outlive us all." Applause rose, gentle and genuine. Miles caught Daniel's eye and smiled. A quiet evening, late that night after everyone had gone, Miles sat alone under the oak tree, the same tree where it had all begun. The lanterns from the party flickered softly above him. He could almost hear Clara's laughter carried by the wind. He closed his eyes and whispered, "You did it, Clara. You turned a house into a home, and a man into a father." The ocean answered with a rhythmic hush. Peace settled over him like a blanket. When Daniel came outside, he found his father dozing lightly in the chair, a half-finished cookie resting beside him. He smiled, picked it up, and took a bite. Still too much sugar, he said to the stars. Final reflection years later. People would still tell the story of Miles Langford, the billionaire who came home unannounced and found something far more valuable than money. They'd speak of Clara Brooks, the woman whose love rippled outward until it touched lives she'd never met. But to Daniel, it was simpler than that. It was the story of a man who learned to listen, a boy who learned to love, and a woman who taught them both that humanity is the greatest inheritance. Because sometimes, the richest moments begin the day someone decides to come home.